everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I'm really pleased to welcome everyone to ODI. Some of you have been here before, some of you haven't. And so welcome to ODI. I'm very pleased you can join us for this conversation on navigating new green trade measures and avoiding a green squeeze on the forest. My name is Jodie Keane. I'm a Senior Research Fellow with the International Economic Development Group. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to His Excellency Terefi Melesi Destra and all of our esteemed speakers here today and for our participants. We are quite a broad church because we've got quite a different range of participants here. We've got people from the private sector, from government, from academia, both based here in the UK and elsewhere. And I appreciate that some of you are on the line and you can join us for the first hour. So I'm going to run through things quite quickly, and each of our lead interventions will speak for about 5 minutes, but we'll hear from Excellency Terefi for around 10 minutes, because we do have a very important conversation to get going here today. It's on the record, so it will be recorded. And we want to encourage the free and frank exchange of views on the subject of hand, and we want to learn more about the current issues at hand. So that's why we're really pleased that we welcome Ambassador Terefi here to join us, and then we will be followed by a number of lead interventions. So we will be followed, the Ambassador's remarks will be followed by Alan Beattie. As you know, Alan Beattie is a senior trade writer at the Financial Times. He's written about the issues of new green trade measures affecting smaller and poorer producers and countries. And he's also highlighted how the EU seems to be seeking to save the planet one tedious spreadsheet at a time. So I'm looking forward to hearing more from you, Alan. And we'll then pass over to David Beer, who is Chief Executive of Trademark Africa. And we're hoping that David can provide us with more information about the realities on the ground. So how supply chains are adapting and what are the implications for trade-related support. Marla is joining us from the World Bank. She's a senior economist. I believe that there's a report kind of to be launched imminently on green trade measures. So we're hoping that Marilla can speak to that report. The bank has also recently provided a number of useful tools, including on CBAM exposure and so on. So we're really pleased that Marilla can join us. And then George, you've recently launched a report on the subject of green trade measures that includes a number of really useful policy recommendations. So I hope you can share more about the key findings from that report. And then David, Professor David Luke, who has unrivaled knowledge about how Africa trades. And I hope, David, that you'll be able to situate this conversation within the kind of broader objective of structural economic transformation on the continent. Before we do get underway, as chair, I do just want to take a couple of minutes just to kind of frame this conversation and just emphasize why it's different from a lot of the other conversations that we're hearing about green trade measures. The conversation here today is not just about the kind of considering green trade measures in terms of their mitigation of climate change, but it's also about considering the extent to which they're supportive of building more resilient value chains. So I also want to bring in this perspective of adaptation. We've heard a lot from others about how the development dimension of green trade measures coming from the EU is missing, but I'd also argue that we're kind of missing this aspect of adaptation and resilience and value chains as well. It's very hard to keep up actually with the kind of developments on this front at the moment. And just last week, I was hearing quite a lot about kind of critical import strategies, critical import strategies and so on. But we really don't hear enough about kind of exports, kind of critical exports to support development and how these may be jeopardized by well-intentioned new trade measures. So we're deeply appreciative of the Excellency for joining us here today to provide some introductory remarks. Some of you may be aware that Ethiopia is currently experiencing a humanitarian crisis that is in part caused by climate change. And it, of course, now faces the spectre of losing market access because of new green trade measures like the European deforestation regulation. I don't want to be kind of bashing EU policy, but I think we just need to be thinking really carefully about how these trade measures how they can better support development objectives as well as address the climate emergency and crisis. We've been speaking about many of these issues for decades. I can remember, looking at the fact that coffee may need to move into higher altitudes in order to adapt to climate change. We've known for a very long time that this is coming. We know that we've had a lot of promises as well about support for trade-related adjustment. But actually, when we zoom into specific country examples, that support and what that support entails, what it looks like, and there's still not enough information about that. So as business adapts, there are very real risks of supply shifting to countries that already have the compliance infrastructure in place. This is, of course, part of competitive advantage, but it's absolutely against this notion of a just transition. So I hope that we can get onto this subject and we can kind of consider this broader overarching objective, how to align the climate goals, development goals, and so on, how we can create more development-friendly trade policy. And I'm sure each of our individual speakers will have specific recommendations to make as well. So further to setting this context, I'd now like to invite Ambassador Terefi Melesi-Destra to provide introductory remarks, and then we'll get the roundtable going, beginning with you, Alan. So thank you very much. Ambassador, over to you. You're on mute, Ambassador.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Good. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to you all. I extend my sincere gratitude to ODI for convening this timely roundtable and to all participants for joining this vital discussion. Let me begin by setting out some of the broader context in which green trade measures are arising. These measures must be understood within the framework of the advancement of sustainable economic growth, structural transformation, and indeed the Sustainable Development Goals. While these goals might not be so widely referred to amongst constituents in the so-called global north, for Ethiopia and our in-country development partners, they are very much serving as guiding principles. Ethiopia have been committed to green growth and afforestation over the years. Moreover, to overcome the climate change challenge, Ethiopia has adopted a climate-resilient green economic strategy. Long before the Paris Agreement and the EU Green Deal initiative, with a view to achieving economic development in an environmentally friendly and sustainable manner. In this spirit, Ethiopia is undertaking massive tree planting initiatives and other conservation activities under the Green Legacy Initiative that was launched in 2019. Since then, Ethiopia has planted over 32.5 billion of seedlings, including many coffee seedlings. While Ethiopia fully supports the European Commission's commitment in advancing the protection of human rights and the environment through due diligence, it would be necessary to look into the matter on customized and country-specific approach. If compliance measures are unduly and untimely imposed, this will negatively impact the livelihoods in the developing nations. Ethiopia has concerns about the new European Union Deforestation-Free Regulation, EUDR, adopted by the European Parliament that has entered into force starting from 29 June 2023. As per the new regulation, coffee placed or made available on the EU market or exported from it as of 30 December 2024 needs to be produced on a land that was not deforested after 31st December 2020. Consequently, each operator is expected to submit a due diligence statement and corresponding geolocation data for all plots of land where the coffee was produced. Therefore, here are some succinct points for consideration in the implementation of EURD. Ethiopia, as a coffee-producing country, has been engaged in various forums and workshops to reflect its concerns on how the new regulation would affect the well-established coffee market between Ethiopia and the EU member states, which constitutes 30% of the country's coffee export. Coffee is Ethiopia's strategic commodity, which is the backbone of the country's economy. It is the mainstay for more than 5 million smallholder farmers, of which 25 to 30% are women, with an average farmland size of 0.5 hectares, resulting in geographic fragmentation. The coffee sector also creates job opportunities for about 25% of the country's population across its value chain, of which women constitute a major share. Coffee is the top most important foreign exchange generating item of the country, which alone constitutes 34% of the country's export earnings. Coffee also accounts about 5% of the country's GDP. Above all, coffee in Ethiopia is more than just a commodity. It is the cultural and social identity of the country and its citizens. The government of Ethiopia is now taking various measures to comply with the EDUR through engaging all actors and stakeholders, including development partners, as the regulation impacts the livelihoods of those smallholder farmers who live below poverty line and other actors in the coffee sector. To this end, the government has prepared a comprehensive 3-year national action plan to implement compliance measures. Discussions are underway, coordinated by the Ministry of Finance and the Ethiopian Coffee and Tea Authority, ECTA, to prepare a compliance roadmap, and technical discussions are underway on a potential territorial approach. Since coffee is produced in a small and fragmented manner by smallholder farmers in Ethiopia, collecting geolocation data would be a complex task with a significant resource implication. It would take several years to fully and effectively implement the action plan, as well as fairly distribute the cost of compliance across the value chain. Putting in place a viable business model would also affect sustainable coffee production system for some time. There is a high risk that smallholder farmers' livelihoods will be adversely impacted given the tight schedule for compliance. This can have social implications in a challenging country context. Further, there remains ambiguity on the nature of the verification process. The challenges and consequences of the EUDR on the coffee sector will add more pressure on an economy that has already been massively affected by multiple disaster risks, ranging from conflict, drought, COVID-19, global value chain disruptions, and other macroeconomic challenges in the last 3 years, including the responsibility of hosting and managing millions of refugees and IDPs. Hence, Ethiopia would like to request its partners to consider the above facts as a base to agree to Ethiopia's request for an extension of the enforcement of the regulation on the Ethiopian coffee exports to the EU market for 3 years. This will enable us to bring all actors together, make a reform in the coffee sector, and put in place a viable business model on top of complying with the regulation. In parallel, Ethiopia requests financial and technical support to fully implement our action plan and also clearly communicate to the operators in the EU market to continue importing Ethiopian coffee with confidence for the duration of the time we requested for extension at the signing of the due diligence statement, and the non-compliance penalty directly falls upon these operators. We are pleased that today's conversation at ODI will further shed light on the challenges and issues at hand, as Ethiopia and other African states and least developing countries navigate new green trade measures. We are not yet a member of the WTO, but we are in the process of accession. Therefore, we encourage our development partners to better consider the linkage between trade, climate, and development objectives. We all need to urgently address the climate crisis, the effects of which will fall hard on our agricultural producers and, as a result, our economy. We must work to ensure that international trade can continue to support technological upgrading and structural economic transformation, both within as well as across sectors. I look forward to hearing the outcomes of the discussion here today as we seek to identify the ways and means to ensure new green trade measures are more supportive of our development aspirations and our shared climate goals. I thank you.
So much, Excellency, for those pertinent points. So to get the roundtable discussion going, I'm going to turn now to each of our lead interventions. In turn, so Alan, over to you. You've described and you've written a lot about the approach of the Commission to date, but are you concerned about this potential kind of supply chain consolidation that we may see because of the combined effects of new green trade measures?
Yeah, I mean, what was very interesting is you asked me to look at resilience and how does this sort of affect resilience. And I'd actually slightly forgotten about resilience because everyone was obsessed with it about 2 or 3 years ago during COVID and so forth. And it was about that. And then it sort of had to jostle with new priorities. I'm sure everyone around this room, not only around this table, not only has heard, but has heard many times the expression that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The EU wants to be a geopolitical player. It wants to be a big trading power. And it wants to lead the world in saving the environment. But aside from its aid budget, really the only big hammer it has to do that is trade policy. So it tries to do multiple things at the same time and according to fashion with its trade policy. It has a single market, right, which it sells. It sells it traditionally for market access through preferential trade agreements to become a trading power. It sells it for geopolitical leverage, which is why it gave, although it's rapidly taking back, trade preferences to Ukraine as part of its effort there. And now it's trying, in a sense, it's trying to sell it for to help the environment. Sabine Weyand, who some of you may know, is the head of DG Trade, says you can't sell this. The problem with the single market is you can't sell it twice. But I've just named 3 times in which it's trying to sell it simultaneously, and I'm pretty sure there are more as well. Now the big way in which it's trying to do it is in CBAM, of course. I know that's not our focus here, but it is very important to see that when you look at something, a policy like CBAM, from the outside, or certainly from the US who loathe it, to them it purely looks like protectionism. It really just does look like those are the EU steel producers wanting to protect themselves. To some people, the same thing looks true of deforestation as well, in the sense that, you know, here is again a rich market trying to keep out exports from the poor market, from poorer countries. But I'm not actually sure that's quite true. I think a lot of it is actually quite rooted in what the EU would call societal preferences. Certainly, if you look at something like deforestation, you know, the ambassador was talking about coffee. Okay, the EU is not exactly a massive coffee producer itself. It is not motivated to do deforestation by protectionism. And there's nothing as dangerous as the EU when it thinks it's got the moral high ground. And I'm seeing to say that so slightly flippantly, but it's sort of slightly, but it's somewhat true as well. As people know, trade in the EU is traditionally done through the Trade Directorate, DG Trade. No one's a massive fan of DG Trade, but DG Trade do at least understand trade, and they understand the technicalities, and they understand what they're dealing with. One of the problems that you have here, both with CBAM and particularly with deforestation, is they're not being dealt with by the trade bits of the Commission. They're being dealt with respectively by TAXUD and by CLIMA. And their appreciation, if you think about their how do I say it? If you think about their incentives and you think about what they're actually aware of, they are much keener on the absolute precision of setting an environmental policy with regard to the EU and with regard to the rest of the EU policy than what it actually looks like on the far side. Now, in a sense, it's actually harder to deal with this than it is to deal with pure protectionism. If you're dealing with protectionism, what you generally do is try and find a producer interest in your trading partner and set that against protectionism. Well, if you're going to be protectionist like that, you know, we'll benefit that producer group. You can't really do that with here because this is based on their perception of their own moral righteousness, and there's nothing you can really lean against it. And so you will end up with a DG that doesn't have experience with trade, doesn't have experience with compliance, and therefore will not only impose these complexities, but also you'll have multiple directors imposing complexities on top of each other. Right? There is no one single window for complying with CBAM and with deforestation. So yes, that's my 5 minutes. It's just we're in a different world now than we were with trade policy, I guess 10, 20, 30 years ago, when it was about market access. It was, it could be quite rough and tough then, but at least you knew where you were, and at least you knew what you were doing was trading off one producer interest against another. Now you are not. You are trading off a often quite insular, very large trading bloc, a hegemon which is used to setting rules for the rest of the world. You're trading that off not against anything within that particular trading bloc, except campaigners and people who understand what the problem is. That's why I think this is a very interesting situation, but it might be quite an intractable situation. And the tools you have to use to solve this as a trade problem are quite different from the ones we're used to solving when the EU is consuming itself only as a trading bloc.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan, for that kind of setting this in the broader context of EU policy development. David Beer, I'd like to turn to you as CEO of Trademark Africa, because you see kind of firsthand how businesses are responding to the new requirements. Can you provide some specific examples of responses? And can you also tell us where you think some of the gaps are at the moment in relation to trade-related support?
Great, thanks, Jodie. Great to see you all. So to begin with a couple of blindingly obvious points. The purpose of any trade measures need to be to enable the private sector to operate in the optimal way possible. Secondly, that any measures imposed will have an asymmetric impact on different economies. It seems like those don't need to be said, but in the context of ambassadors and Alan's points, I think sometimes we forget that. As an institution that's dedicated to tackling trade barriers and to enhancing the export capacity of firms from Africa, we're focused heavily on ensuring that African companies are positioned to be competitive in this new dispensation. And make no mistake, it is a new world. The WTO has said that the proportion of trade restrictions that are environment related has grown from 8% in 97 to 19% in 21. There's now 100 countries with climate-related trade restrictions on their books. I know EU CBAM is the big story and big game in town, but it's not the only one. This is a much bigger conversation. And while the world is finally drawing the link between climate and trade, it's all too easy to forget about the third leg of the stool, which is development. The Jacques Delors Institute has traced an increasing blowback from developing countries as climate-related trade restrictions are being seen to lack the conferral of agency as part of a new green imperialism. ECDPM has talked about kicking away the ladder. These perceptions matter in a multilateral world. And the concerns that we're hearing about as Trademark with our clients and from our stakeholders on the continent are exactly this. They're not only around the content of climate-related trade restrictions that are rapidly being imposed, but also the nature of consultation on these. So my first framing point is the right voices need to be at the table if we're going to ensure that measures are well targeted and well received. Second point is that beyond the impact of trade measures themselves and the quality of consultation, the cost of compliance cannot be ignored. And I think the ambassador made this point quite eloquently for Ethiopia. Even if I'm confident I can demonstrate as an avocado grower the low carbon footprint of my production, the absence of deforestation in developing my orchards, the high environmental standards of my company, I have to prove all of this to multiple off-taking jurisdictions. And that burden can rapidly become unsustainable, especially for SMEs. Thirdly, this is not only about formal trade measures. We are as concerned about the impact of informal measures emerging from commercial off-takers in response to consumer preferences. The problem with these is they can be imposed overnight, they can be imposed without consultation or recourse, and they can be imposed without transitional support. This is part of the burning platform that we see today. So to get the heart of your question, what can African exporters do about all of this? Firstly, get ahead of the game. We believe the continent can position itself as a pioneer in green trade, and we're certainly working towards that. So, for example, 95% of East African flowers bought in Europe are transported by air. Consumers are becoming more climate conscious, supermarkets are producing labelling accordingly, or even removing products shipped by air freight entirely from their stock. No matter that the overall carbon footprint, including transport in the winter months of a Kenyan flower, is lower than the one grown in a Dutch greenhouse, it's all about perception and consumers. So, for example, the Kenya Flower Council and other business apex bodies in the country that we're working with are aiming to shift transportation of flowers from air freight to sea freight to 50% within 6 years by 2030. That's the target that we're holding ourselves to. The technology now exists to make this a successful intermodal shift, and it happens to be cheaper. And there's a whole separate conversation about this concept that green policies are always more expensive for companies. It's not necessarily the case. It's about unpicking the risk of those policies and helping companies to adapt. So the key in this particular example is reducing the risk of spoilage through how perishables are handled and harnessing the cold chain technologies we need to cut those transport times. So Trademark is working in concert with logistics companies, with agricultural production companies, with authorities, with international partners to ensure that we get all of those pieces in place to make that shift. Second piece of the jigsaw is cutting the cost of compliance with all of these additional trade measures. Now, I think the Ambassador made a very good point about the importance of transitional periods. We still need to get to the answer of how we reduce that cost. And I think there are some very interesting pieces of innovation out here linked to traceability, non-falsifiability of core processes. If we can digitize some of these trade processes, then we can significantly reduce the cost and the risk. And we're trying to do that. We've created, for example, a blockchain-based digital logistics platform that can bolt on many of these pieces of information that you need in that trade flow. Perhaps more boringly, we can't ignore road transport. That's the lifeblood of exports out of the continent that we work on. Congestion on the roads responsible for up to 60% of the emissions from freight transport in some countries. So there's a lot of basic trade facilitation solutions that we can put in place to reduce the carbon footprint of transport linked to our exports. So we're working with companies on the continent that are really keen to find some of these solutions, be it developing e-truck fleets. Even I was chatting with a great company that's introduced 1,000 electric motorbikes in Nairobi recently, to working on some of the basics of reducing carbon on traditional transport. Some of the challenges here, because it obviously hasn't happened at scale yet, primarily lack of finance. Electric truck costs up to two to three times that of a conventional diesel-powered truck, similar capacity. Yet we see the countries that we work with, financial systems in some of these really crucial areas for green investment are just not developed enough. So even for large domestic banks, green lending is primarily from resources provided by DFIs, development finance institutions, with very limited blending of their own resources. This is compounded by Africa receiving only about 3% of climate finance, in spite of this massive adaptation challenge. So again, if I'm a mid-sized private sector player wanting to switch my fleet to electric trucks, that's going to be extraordinarily challenging in this context. Trademark's created a commercial arm called Trade Catalyst Africa to try to leverage some of the patient capital in order to help do that, but we need to do so much more. And then the other side of this is changing regulations. So we're working with companies, building platforms, for example, for logistics operators to advocate for the changes in regulations that we need to see. Anything from fuel standards to the challenge of backhaul, that's a massive burden on reducing the carbon efficiency of transporting goods, to reducing tariffs on environmental products and technologies. I think World Bank colleague can correct me, but a recent study estimated that could that could result in a 14% increase to trade if we get that right. So there's a lot that we can do. There's a lot that we need to do. I think the innovations and the knowledge exists. The will exists. Many of the companies and the governments that we work with are extremely keen to make that change. But we have to have collective action at the international level, and we have to have transitional support and transitional arrangements that will allow this to happen. Perhaps one cautionary tale, I spent 4 years in Malawi. It used to have one of the world's biggest groundnuts sectors. That disappeared almost overnight back in the 1970s when regulations were changed pretty much overnight within Europe without transitional arrangements. And we were decades later trying to get that back. So there's a serious risk here, but there's also many opportunities. We've got the eminent Professor Luke on the panel. He's also a board director of Trademark. He's pointed out that despite all the risks, if we get this right, we can actually see an increase in African agricultural exports through the implementation of climate-related trade measures, but only if we get it right. The risk is there will be a massive cost. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, and David. So a lot of points there that we can hopefully pick up in the roundtable conversation. So Marilla, I'd like to pass over to you now for your intervention, because obviously the World Bank has come out to be now pretty vocal about some of the concerns in relation to unilateral green trade measures. We heard some of those concerns voiced at COP28, for example. Could you elaborate a little bit further in terms of the support that you're providing at the moment to assist producers in adapting to new green trade measures, perhaps provide us with some information that's coming from your forthcoming report?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. Indeed, we are really worried about a number of policies that are now being developed. So we've done quite a bit of analysis on CBAM and the EU deforestation regulation, and we're really concerned that those policies will raise compliance cost levels that cannot really be met by small and medium companies in developing countries or farmers in Ethiopia, and that they might be excluded from global value chains. There is also the new Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. It's not, of course, not implemented yet, but that's another issue that we're looking into. So I'll limit the first intervention to discuss our work on this, and we've done quite a lot of analytics, data, tools, and I'm happy maybe to, as we get another chance to speak, to say a little bit more about what the World Bank is doing to assist the developing countries in meeting those challenges. One tool that we've developed recently is the CBAM Exposure Index. As we highlight, the CBAM is a complement to the EU ETS. It's created there to prevent carbon leakage, and we understand the motivation behind the policy, but we're really worried about the potential implications for developing countries. So first, to understand who will be exposed to this measure and who could face those financial obligations when they start in 2026, we developed the CBAM Exposure Index, which looks at the relative emission intensity by scope in the products impacted by the regulations for at the global level. And what we found, for example, is that Mozambique's exports of aluminum or Zimbabwe's exports of ferroalloys are among the most vulnerable products. And again, to take a step back at the macro level, for most countries, it does not, those CBAM impacted goods do not constitute a large share of total exports. However, for some products, this is quite significant. So, for example, exports of products that are under CBAM for Mozambique constitute 20% of total exports, or 7% for Ukraine. So that's already a significant potential macro impact if those exports were to be impacted. Now, we've developed these measures to try to understand the embedded carbon price as per dollar of export. And just to give you an example of how we look into it, for example, when you look at Mozambique aluminum exports to the EU, their the scope 1 emission intensity is 10 times that of the average EU producer. So it's only when you include emission intensity scope 2. So just a reminder, scope 1 are direct emissions from owned controlled forces, and scope 2 are those from the energy generation. And since Mozambique has relatively clean energy, that emission intensity drops to 2.5 times that of the average EU producer. However, initially, only scope 1 will be taken into consideration. So even though Mozambique is relatively more competitive, when you look at the scope 2 emissions, that will only come with time and when the CBAM is expanded to scope 1 and scope 2. But moving on, I just want to highlight that there are some producers that are cleaner than EU. There are very, very few examples that we're able to to discover. But for example, Albania's iron and steel exports to EU may be less and emission intensive than the bloc's average. So that could make Albania, if they're less vulnerable to CBAM and possibly more competitive after the introduction of the regulation. But the reason for concern is of course clear, but the impact of such border measures will only grow. So not only the CBAM is likely to be expanded to cover scope 3 as well, eventually post 2030, but also to cover more products. But also there are other countries that are considering developing their own mechanisms, such as UK, Canada, Japan, and others. Now let me move to the EUDR, and His Excellency Ambassador Melissa Desta has already very well elaborated on the challenges faced by Ethiopia and by many developing countries. So we ourselves have also been looking into the exposure at different country levels. So that's another toolkit that we provided on the World Bank website, just trying to understand what's the exposure. And we've also looked at that for some countries, it's a significant share of total exports. And we've, of course, mentioned the small-scale farmers in Ethiopia and the potential poverty implications that if they were to lose access to EU market and if they are unable to redirect those exports to other countries, which we know it's not easy. It's costly to find new markets, and on top of it, this can really reduce the efficacy of EUDR instead of trying to consider deforestation as one of the factors when planting crops. The farmers will simply have to find new markets. Then, of course, the EUDR will not achieve its objective. So what we wanted, we are doing some technical assistance in Peru, trying to assist the exporters there of coffee to meet the requirements. And just we want to highlight that harmonization is critical, and it's not only about standards and regulations, but also about the due diligence requirements. There's so many new requirements that the exporters need to are exposed to. So like US Forest Act, UDR, and other countries are coming up with their own regulations. At the same time, there's a proliferation of the private sector due diligence requirements. So whether that be financial or legal, which adds another layer of complexity. So we wanted to highlight the importance of not only harmonizing standards regulations, but also thinking of a common approach to due diligence. Finally, the last issue I wanted to highlight, it's further on the horizon, and not many companies that will be affected in the short run, the EU CS3D, so Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. But as with deforestation regulations, compliance costs might force some exporters in developing countries to redirect exports to less regulated markets. So major exporters might react by excluding small and medium-sized enterprises as they perceive them as risky for their value chains. Basically, we're already hearing from big companies in US that they will be less likely to trade with smaller exporters because they simply will not be able to comply with the requirements of the corporate sustainability due diligence directives in the EU or US. And it will also have a significant impact on the potential export revenues, integration into value chain, and so on. We've already looked into it, and we think that sectors such as metal products, chemicals might be most affected. And again, Ethiopia, Niger, one of the countries that really rely on export revenues and exports for jobs and development will be highly exposed. So I'm happy to come back to how we're assisting in those countries, but just wanted to say that those three policies, even though so EUDR, CBAM, and Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, though they are all related with different challenges to developing countries' exporters, and that's something we need to be mindful of. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Marina. So it's very good for you to emphasise these points about Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions as well. And you mentioned the CSDDD, so that's the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And I believe there's a vote this coming week on that. So George, I realise I didn't introduce you properly, but George Riddell, Director of Trade Strategy at EY, and you have written quite a lot on this subject. So we're hoping that you may be able to tell us a bit more about how business is adapting to these new green trade measures and the sorts of shifts that you're seeing in supply chains. Are you seeing shifts away from certain types of producers, or are you seeing any cases of kind of investment and being made by lead firms in value chains? That would be really helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Jodie, and thank you to ODI for organising a fascinating discussion and really timely. I think just in reference to the paper that we launched last week, given that Jodie's already mentioned it, I can do a shameless plug. But effectively what we did was, a couple of these have already been mentioned, but the scale of change for businesses at the moment is huge. We've mentioned deforestation, CBAM and CSDDD. Let me just add some others. Forced labour, CSRD, critical raw materials, plastic packaging taxes, extended producer responsibility, waste and other packaging, circular economy regulations, expansions to REACH and some of the chemical inputs into different products. The compliance obligations on businesses at the moment wanting to trade into the EU and other European countries, because it's not just the EU, is absolutely huge at the moment. And one of the things is we sometimes like this conversation, we take them in silos, and it's absolutely important that we do because there are sectoral issues with each of them. But for many businesses that operate across, different sectors, they are going to be hit by these regulations at different points in time, and understanding how we could theoretically break down some of those silos, whether it's from the business perspective around data collection and submission, reporting requirements, penalty alignments, the fact that between, CBAM and deforestation, you've got completely different customs processes in place at the moment because DG Environment and DG Taxud haven't really spoken to each other about these issues, and that's before you get to EU member state customs authorities. It is a real challenge, and I think the implementation of these can be hugely improved. And we've also, I think there are real areas for international cooperation between jurisdictions that are looking to pursue these measures, whether it's the alignment of methodologies, it's looking at risk factors for, in the case of deforestation, all of these things, that there are huge opportunities to improve how they function, both in practice and with businesses as well. I think in terms of what we're seeing from businesses themselves, and through my work, I often work with the lead firms, so those that have the long supply chains that are looking to coordinate across many stakeholders. I think the headline message is they may not like all of this, but if they want to continue operating in the EU, they have to comply. For them, this is not a choice. This is not something they can get angry about. This is not something they can, they can lobby on it and, with different stakeholders, but where it is the law, they have to comply and they have to submit the declaration. So I think the mindset from the business community is always focused on that. In terms of where some of the challenges that we're seeing arise, definitely responsibility is one of them within the business. These are often hybrid measures. They're not taxes, they're not trade measures, they're not really pure sustainability measures either. So where is there that responsibility in the business, and upskilling teams that aren't necessarily used to dealing with this? Take your average customs team or your procurement team. Before, their job was to get things from A to B as quickly and cheaply as possible. That was the job. Today, they're being asked to incorporate as part of their decision-making process all of these additional requirements, and there is that upskilling that's needed. There's new IT systems in order to document all of this needed, so that's requiring quite a lot of investment at the moment. You've got to completely rewrite your contractual relationships. How do you assign liability? in the case that, you know, information is not given in the right way? How do you do your verification? So there's a lot around the supply chain contracts aspect of all of this. And then finally, that question of resources is a really good one. We know that, you know, some players in Australia, for example, do have the resources on the large farms to take photos from geolocation of every single tree on the farm. And they've done that. And they've been doing that for a little while now. If you're dealing with small scale producers in, you know, different parts of the world, they're not going to be able to do that. So what mechanisms can they put in place to do that due diligence and feed it up to their buyers? I think is a huge question. Finally, in all of this, just 2 points that I don't want to get missed. One is there's actually a real value add for many businesses who can comply, because they can charge high premiums. So we've already seen market movements with companies who are in these regions going, hey, I've got all the documentation for EUDR. You don't have to worry about me. Here's the verification. And they're able to get, you know, preferential access into the supply chain. So not to forget that aspect of it. And the other is just, David made this point, supply chain transparency and visibility is going to be a huge part of all of this. So efforts around digitalization, around more supply chain transparency and interoperability of digital systems, I think will help.
Thank you very much indeed, George. That's super helpful to better understand how supply chains are shifting and adapting. And good to know that some producers are able to command a higher price through their compliance and so on. So David, obviously you've written a lot about how Africa trades. So I was hoping that you would be able to kind of, you know, discuss these new green trade measures in terms of the kind of bigger objective and the continental ambition to industrialize and so on, and perhaps make reference to specific sectors or products or countries where you can see kind of significant impacts, maybe both positive and negative.
Thank you, Jody, and thanks also for having me on this panel. I think the discussion so far has been very fascinating. All the different insights coming from different work that is being done in this area. First point I would like to make is to underscore something that's already been said, and that is we now live in a very different world. No question about that. Also, of course, we are seeing these challenges to comply with all these measures that are rising from this new world that we're in. Collective action internationally, I think the way that the NPL put it is yet to emerge in a coherent way, and that's what I'd like to focus my intervention on mainly. But also to say that, yes, in this conversation, the development dimension seems to be getting lost. I think that's it needs to be brought back, and we need to go back to the fundamental principles around common and differentiated responsibilities, respective capacities, and how we can build capacity. Because in a sense, everyone has been talking about compliance, and in a sense, you know, fundamentally, it's about how you can build capacities and so on. The EU has put the matter on the agenda through the policies it has adopted, and I think Alan Beattie has elaborated on that. Although I'm not quite so sure that DigiTrade has not had much to do with all of this, because I would want to imagine that DigiTrade does look very carefully at the trade implications of various measures, wherever they are emanating or whoever is responsible within the Commission, and is very keen on this because DigiTrade, as we know, Alan did mention how good they are at the technicalities, always wants to ensure that it's in a good position to respond to challenges and so on. So on that point, maybe I'll slightly differ that DigiTrade does have a role in this. But as I said, the main issue that I want to address is this lack of coherence in the international response so far. So we do have different instruments for dealing with the carbon emissions and abatement strategies and so on, whether it's through taxes, subsidies, of course, the border adjustment, or even how you can give credit for carbon sinks and so on. But all these different instruments, different approaches being discussed in fora that are not necessarily speaking to each other. So maybe we want to take a step back and just ask ourselves if there are better ways of approaching this, recognizing, of course, that this is a hugely complex area. There are sectoral issues. I think Judge pointed that out very well. Some sectoral complexities, etc. But in wanting to sort of see how you can take a comprehensive view and how you can join all these different aspects, perhaps we need to just remind ourselves of some fundamentals. Firstly, the price of carbon is about 80% of global emissions remain on price, which I think is huge. The global average price of carbon is only $3. Also, I think we need to remind ourselves that 4 countries are responsible for 2/3 of the emissions that we see, and that, of course, is the US, and then, of course, the EU as a bloc, India, and China. The G20, if we include all of the G20, are responsible for 85% of the of global carbon emissions. So the IMF has put forward its proposal on an international carbon price floor, which I think is not being given much focus and thought and consideration. But I think it's an approach that could help us deal with this issue in a way that brings the development dimension back into the equation, and also in a way that helps us to respond to the necessity of dealing with the externalities from carbon emission. And essentially, what the IMF was proposing with the international carbon price floor is a situation where perhaps you could have a carbon price for different categories of countries. So for the least developed and low-income countries, you could have one price. I think the suggestion was a price of $25 per ton of CO2, and then emerging economies at $50, advanced economies at $75, which of course takes into account the different contributions to global emissions and so on. This, of course, also has implications for the current way in which countries are trying to respond to their own emissions footprint, which is through naturally determined contributions as provided for in the Paris Agreement. I believe Article 4 of the Paris Agreement. Problem with that is that much of what they put out as their NDCs is unfunded. If you take the case of, say, of Kenya, as an example, its NDC for the period 2020 to 2030 is costed at about $63 billion, and of that 63 billion, only about 8 billion is funded, which means that really it's not a realistic prospect, just given also all the difficulties we know about funding and financing the carbon, the climate transition, and so on. So I think there is something to be said for this kind of approach that puts a price on carbon for all countries. And of course, provides a source of revenue as well to deal with all these sectoral issues which are not going to go away. And as we've been hearing from everyone, and the ambassador and everyone else who spoke after him, that the cost of compliance is something that we need to keep in mind. So I think this kind of approach, its revenue mobilization implications, is something that we can look at and can help us to come back to the basics here as to who's responsible for the most emissions, how can we price carbon in some realistic way, and so on. Now, Johnny, you also asked, and I'll end on this, on how African countries in their own transition and aspirations towards industrialization can approach these issues. Again, let me quote, quoting me, I guess that if we can get it right, then, we could see, great things happening. But I think even for African countries, as indeed they try to become competitive in the productive processes and responding to this new global context, you're going to find that countries that have less emission in their productive processes will also want to ensure that the issues around carbon leakage dealt with in their own, in that context of taking an integrated regional approach towards their industrial development. So even for the African countries, the problem doesn't go away. It's there, whether we're looking at inter-African trade or looking at Africa's trade with the rest of the world. So the problem of away is also there. And being competitive in this new world, obviously, is a challenge that all African countries have to face as well, along with the sectoral issues that we'll be talking about as well. So I'll just end with this, that for me, especially taking part in discussions such as this, it does leave me a bit impressed in the sense that, really all these different conversations, different approaches, solutions are taking place, different for which are not apparently talking to each other. And so we are very far as an international community from a comprehensive kind of approach to these issues. So let me leave it at that.
Thank you very much indeed, David. So I think we've had kind of a wide range of interventions in terms of the points that have been made. The ambassadors obviously emphasised the need for more time to adapt, and perhaps also the Commission needs some time to kind of get its own house in order, given the issues that Alice has raised. Business is adapting, but as you rightly emphasised, David, at the international level, it is all quite fragmented at the current time, which is quite tricky for countries to navigate. So I think we'd like to open up the discussion now. But before we do open up, we've got one more intervention. So I'd like to invite Felix to the line. Felix, if you're able to just briefly introduce yourself. I think what Felix wanted to do is just to kind of spotlight and highlight some of these issues for the Ethiopian coffee sector in particular, before we open up to the wider discussion. So, Felix, thanks for joining us. If you could just share your points, we've got about 3 minutes, that would be super helpful. Thank you. There may be further questions as well as we get into the discussion.
Yes, can you hear me good?
Yes.
Okay, good. So what I did since 2008, I started to actually buy fully roasted coffee in Ethiopia and then sell it directly to the German trade, so Edeka, Rewe. So we are roasting in Addis Abeba. So we are buying about 200 tons on an annual base, and then we are shipping directly from the roastery the finished product, which looks like this. Maybe you can see that. And then we ship that product directly to the German supermarkets. We have started quite small, and now we have about 1 or 2 containers per month. And by that, we have about 150 people working in the roastery, but also in the printers and the technicians which are supporting the roastery. So this is about, we calculated about 60% of added value when you compare it to green coffee export. So about 60% is the value addition. And what I found interesting also politically is that since only 2008, the EU actually stopped punishing basically value-added products from Ethiopia. So until 2008, you could import green coffee with 0% custom duty, but you had to pay 30% custom duty when you import roasted coffee from Ethiopia. So basically, we as Europeans, we actually made sure that the raw material enters the EU very cheaply and that we do the value addition, but that we avoid actually buying ready products and giving some of the value addition in coffee to the origin of the coffee. So this is, of course, a bit similar maybe now to a situation where we put in another amount of laws and regulations that could also rather make difficulties to the coffee producers, especially, of course, the smaller farmers, which have difficulties to comply with all the new regulations that are coming up right now. So that's it from my side. The goal is at one point to have all of the Ethiopian coffee roasted in the country. So by that, there would be probably about 2 million people who would have much better paid jobs than currently a coffee farmer has. We pay about 10 times higher salaries in the value addition process compared to the average Ethiopian monthly salary. Well, of course, maybe one more sentence to that. To do that and to sell finished products from the Ethiopian market, you actually need a very good logistics, because you need a logistic that is going flawless, very fast from Ethiopia to Germany. You need about 3 to 4 weeks. So we are fighting many times with bureaucracies in Ethiopia also, but also with availabilities of containers and so on. The train now from Addis to Djibouti has improved a little bit, but there's still a lot of things that needs to be done in the logistical process to make a finished product entering the European market in a very good competitive way. So there's a bit of work to be done, but from my experience I have since the last 15 years is that you can only do that by learning and slowly growing the business and learning what needs to be adapted to the value and to the logistical chain. And as you learn and improve, you understand what is actually needed. That's it from my side. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Felix. It's extremely helpful to better understand the value chain dynamics there in terms of value addition and the risks, therefore, that this measure could really set back the industry. I can see some hands are raised, so perhaps we'll take the hand that is raised online, and then we can open up the discussion round to the floor, then Dirk Willem afterwards. I think, is that Dario on the line with the hand up? Dario, over to you for your thoughts, and then we'll pass to Dirk Willem.
Yes, simply to ask the physical dimension that we have found for this green squeeze that you mentioned, Jody. So essentially, something that is observed in Ethiopia, and the ambassador may say something about this, is that with climate warming, the yields of coffee in Ethiopia have been going down. So they were already very low. If you compare them against Latin American countries like Brazil or Colombia, they are a third to a half of the yields they have. And they are going down, especially in the low areas where coffee from I think 1,200 meters above, this area has been going down significantly. And what I heard from Ermias Ejeda, with whom I'm working on the project that you asked us to do, running a CGE model, is that they are thinking in moving the production up, but this would go against the regulation of the EU, which doesn't have a space for trading an area that is deforested against the reforestation or afforestation of areas where they used to have coffee, but now with all the pests and diseases that get with climate change, they can't get much coffee out.
Thank you very much, Dario. Yes, and that is indeed part of this adaptation challenge there as well. So that's very, very helpful. Dirk Willem.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And it's a very comprehensive set of presentations. Very, very interesting. So I want to reflect on one or two of them. Firstly was Ellen Beattie, I think, sort of on the Commission, the European Union having a sort of more high ground and wanting to keep that. And I remember 10, 15 years ago working on sustainable development issues and so on at that time, a report for the European Commission. And at the time, policy coherence for development was part of that. Right? Part of that, having the moral high ground is you would be, you couldn't be accused of being incoherent. That would be almost the worst. Nobody likes to be accused of that. So I'm wondering where that is going at the moment. I just Googled some, see whether there are still some reports from the European Parliament, and they're still sort of saying that there needs to be more policy here. So I think that's maybe perhaps the next stage. Is it used to be about trade and development, sort of on what Duncan Green has announced his retirement today from Oxfam. But I think that was sort of with the cows and so on, and the subsidies. That was 20 years ago. Is there now time for a new way to look at that and to sort of look at policy coherence in the Commission more seriously? Secondly, on George, briefly on sort of business can't complain, or they won't complain. They can just have to do it. I'm wondering whether sort of if you look in the UK, there are obviously reports on red tape, and so maybe that becomes part of it, right? So that over time, and particularly in over the coming years, there's going to be more sort of more red tape, and that's also in developing countries. So it's one is about the substance of the measure, but secondly is how it's being addressed and sort of and imposed and so on. And maybe that can be some streamlined red tape. And finally, I think the point was sort of David and Dave, which I find very interesting. So, and also it's about kicking away the lever, which again I think Duncan and Hajim Chang popularized 20 years ago. I suppose if that is indeed the case now, the environmental space. And you might have the same on digitalization as well. So if you think of business as usual, those countries that already has a digital base develop faster, and those that don't already have a digital base face increased difficulties. Do we need to really think about almost like a Marshall Plan, as it were, at least active policies? And it's not just business as usual, making markets work, but actually an active approach to countering this. And that's where the Green sees, I suppose, that you popularized. Jody comes in. It's that actually a response to all of this is our active policies that really think about where the niches for various countries in the value chains and problems of digitalization, but also in the area of climate change. And that quite a very fundamentally different approach from sort of the investment climate. Everything will be fine. We really targeted development approaches here to counter some of the impacts.
Thanks very much, Dirk Williams. Plenty of food for thought there as we will come back to the rest of the conversation. James and yes, Liz as well. So perhaps Liz and then James. Yeah.
Yeah, similar to Dirk, I've got a few kind of observations from all the different excellent interventions. I think one of the things which hasn't come out that clearly so far is that a lot of these supply chains are very concentrated. So I think the ambassador said that when we're looking at cost of compliance, one of the things we really need to look at is who bears that and how supply chain pressures can be used to, for example, price negotiations to force lower prices, even using the threat of maybe changing sourcing practices in order to kind of push that risk and cost down the supply chain. I mean, certainly with the deforestation regulation. Thinking about David's slightly sort of depressing, the second David or the third David speaking today, his slightly depressing conclusion. I think we do have to be realistic about how serious some of the actors are about any of these ideas about flexibility looking at like longer transition periods, even looking at resources to support compliance. I don't see a great deal of political will at the moment behind that. And even if there was greater political will behind that, my experience in the past, and others around the table may have had similar experiences of using aid for trade type measures to try and restructure industries or move suppliers onto new industries. They've just been utter failures. I can't think of any really good examples. I've worked on sugar, I've worked on bananas, and yeah, I don't see anything very positive coming out of the use of aid for trade there. So I think we need to look differently at how you would manage some of this. And I think one of the things that comes into my head is how we monitor the impacts, and maybe looking on a commodity basis. So can you monitor farm gate prices to see what the impacts and how they're working? Can you look at monitoring sourcing decisions? Can you use some of the forums like the Coffee Association, it's called the World Coffee Organization, and the same for cocoa, to try and get a bit more in depth about how these initiatives are really impacting smallholders. And the final observation I had, a bit what Dirk was saying about Duncan and Arjun and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I think, and also to what Alan Beattie was saying, there has been, I think, development, civil society organisations have taken their eye off the ball to a certain extent, and there's been a shift. If you look at the big development NGOs, there's been a shift towards working on climate, and there's been a real loss of expertise on trade and on supply chains and on the nitty-gritty on industrialisation and on development. And I think maybe some of that's coming back to haunt us. And I think, as Alan was saying, that, you know, the drive for the Commission is European consumers and it is European campaigners. And so I think maybe there's a job of education there to raise people's awareness about some of the unintended consequences, which, you know, maybe some of those organisations might be unwilling to see, but they should be made aware of.
Thanks very much indeed, Liz. So yeah, I know we had a good for development label idea a very, very long time ago. I think, James, you might have been involved at the time. I remember, Alan, you wrote about it as well many, many moons ago. But James, looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Yeah, looking here.
Okay, yeah. Afternoon, I'm James McGregor. I'm representing the Fair Miles Consortium of companies and NGOs, government officials around the world, supporting the imports into the European Union and into the UK of fresh fruit and vegetables and other commodities and products from the global south. This is something that came out of work that ODI and a number of people in this room and on the calls were involved in almost 20 years ago, looking to debunk the Food Miles campaign. Campaign may be the wrong word, but the concept that was around, that was changing how consumers in Europe and the UK thought about food and how they interacted with the daily decisions that they were making. This was debunked using some great data, including the data on the number of livelihoods affected. The science behind that, the way that that's integrated into decisions wasn't necessarily taken forward, and is a real challenge. And a challenge I want to sort of put on the table here is if we're looking at all these complexities, carbon emissions, water use, energy efficiency, etc. Some of these are really easy to put numbers on, or at least put proxy numbers on. When we start looking at people's livelihoods and jobs, particularly in the global south, it's challenging. If we're going to help private sector, small, medium, large, make better decisions which involve all of these issues, we're going to need to put some numbers on the table, not just have carbon emissions. The green seas, the green squeeze, both sort of demonstrate this very, very well. And it has been said, possibly by me, I'm sure by others, that we should be optimistic when we think about the global south's comparative advantages. Great farmers, the right kind of weather for growing things, etc. How do we begin to bring that to a position where a business, food business or other businesses, can make decisions which involve those livelihoods and support them in an optimistic, positive way, as opposed to being seen as a negative.
Thanks very much indeed, James. So yeah, starting to put some numbers on the table, I think, looking beyond carbon emissions, but to consider this livelihoods approach, I think would be helpful as well. So we've got quite a few people on the line. I can see quite a bit of chat in the chat box here, but no hands up. So I'm going to start picking on people if that's okay. And I can see, Simon, you've been quite active on here, and you've also provided me with some very helpful information and data in terms of compliance costs and so on. So I wondered if you could help us to better understand from your perspective, what do these, how much do these new reporting requirements cost? I think you mentioned to me previously that you felt that all of these measures are kind of increasing the jobs of the audit sector at the expense of you're having to employ people to fill out these spreadsheets and so on. So Simon, if you're on the line to provide a few remarks, and now I can see a hand from someone else as well, Rolf. Great. So if we go with Simon first and then Rolf afterwards. Simon is there, or he's disappeared. Yeah, you're on mute at the moment. Try now. No, take it. You need to take it off and maybe unplug it. Yeah, we might have to move to Rolf. Maybe here we are.
Sorry, just changed my settings. Apologies for that. Great, yes. You're absolutely right in terms of audit requirements. They are very high and increasing. Just for context, we're a business which makes prepared fruit, so cut fruit, value added, in Ghana, Egypt, South Africa, Brazil, Benin, exporting to different countries around the world, particularly in the European Union, and in particularly the UK as well. We're not sort of big enough as an organisation to be subject to quite a lot of this legislation, but we are finding ourselves increasingly indirectly impacted. I mean, we've always been subject to lots of audits. I put in the chat, mainly because we're operating in countries which are seen as high risk. So a lot of the kind of voluntary standards that a lot of the retailers apply, we have to, we're subjected to. And we're just sort of looking ahead at a lot of the legislation, doing a lot of risk analysis ourselves to see how much it's going to impact us, not necessarily directly, but probably indirectly. In fact, we know indirectly, because we know that there are some retailers who are getting ahead of some of this legislation by doing more and more of this due diligence. And of course, it's not just the customers that we supply to, it's the funders as well. Those that are providing the finance are increasingly conducting due diligence as well. In terms of the cost of audits, so we estimate that we do an audit for every week of the year, third-party audit for every week of the year, costing the business in the region of £1.5 million a year just on audits. So it takes a huge amount of work, and we've got a big technical team across the business, and a lot of their time is spent on organising and carrying out these audits. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour. But we can anticipate that there's only going to be more of this to come. But how much more can we manage whilst ensuring the business remains able to be commercially viable at the end of the day? We don't want to be a business that's just doing audits all the time. We want to be making products.
Yeah, I guess it's also, how if you're undertaking so many audits every week, and your new standards and adherence and so on. I guess for trade economists, trade and development economists, we always think about spillovers and knowledge spillovers. So what's your response when people say that there are potential beneficial effects? I mean, how would you see those being materializing in practice in a country like Benin, for example, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are benefits. I think where there's no structures in place at all, it kind of helps in terms of compelling you to put those structures in place, ensuring you've got all the right policies in place, as long as they're not just there to tick boxes. So certainly that they can have a benefit, but like what we've seen with many sort of standards is that there's a lot of overlapping standards. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you just had one standard for everything, and you didn't have different people asking for asking you to I guess adhere to different standards, which effectively all mean the same thing. So yeah, I think that there can be benefits, but at the moment, just because of the just because there are so many, what do they call it? The sort of proliferation of audits that I think it's difficult to kind of see the benefits, and that's a shame because undoubtedly that there are and there can be.
Thanks very much. So I'd like to pass over now to Rolf, and then Nimrod, and then Mari, you also. Yes.
Hello, good afternoon, Joe, and all participants. I'm Rolf Traeger, Chief of the LDC section in UNCTAD. And I'd like to come back to something which was mentioned by different participants, including by David, which is the development dimension, but particularly the case of the least developed countries. And we in UNCTAD, we did a study of the potential impacts of CBAM on LDCs. And the results were really bleak, particularly because CBAM targets some of the sectors which are particularly important for industrialization, like aluminium, cement, steel, etc., etc. So this could have very, very adverse effects on the prospects for industrialization of LDCs. Now, the whole purpose of the existence of the LDC category is for the international community to come up with international support measures, which take into account their specific needs and circumstances, etc. So I'd like to ask participants, in view of this green squeeze, how could there be some special and differential treatment be devised for LDCs? Of course, we talk a lot about capacity building, financing, technical assistance, about which traditionally there's a lot of talk, but very little acts and enactment. And so what would be possible solutions? For instance, in the case of CBAM, as it was being discussed, there was talk that the proceeds of CBAM might be directed to LDCs, or that LDCs could be exempted from CBAM, none of which happened. So is there any better prospects in view of these other green trade measures? Thank you.
Very much, Rolf. So quite a provocative question there. We will go back to the panel when we wrap up to answer some of these points. Nimrod, and then yes, Mari, and then David. Yes, another David. Nimrod.
Yes, thanks. Look, I think the CBAM.
Yeah, you're kind of cutting in and out, I'm afraid.
Switch off the video.
Yeah. Nimrod, you're kind of freezing, your screen is frozen. Maybe if you turn off the video. Okay. Oh, Rolf, I think your audio is on still, Rolf. And Nimrod, we can't hear you at the moment, so we'll hold. We'll come back to you. So, Mari, you have yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Jodie. I'm Mari Dupar, and I'm in Global Risks and Resilience at ODI. And I'm perhaps a bit unusual in ODI because my programme, the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, works so much with communities. on how they're addressing climate action. And I think I'd like to go back to the sort of need for a holistic approach that Professor Luke highlighted in his remarks, which is, you know, why is the deforestation regulation there? What are the sort of drivers behind it? And I think is probably coming about because not just the climate crisis, but the sixth great extinction, the global biodiversity crisis. And what we're seeing in our documentation of resilience, climate resilience, livelihoods development in communities across the developing world in CDKN is that there are so many multi-dimensional adaptation, resilience, livelihoods development benefits from conserved forest ecosystems that they are not well documented. And that policies are not necessarily aligned with preserving the multi-dimensional benefits, not just to local people, but on regional scales and river basin scales as well. So I think from my perspective, I can only really echo Professor Luke's call for better climate finance, but better biodiversity finance and better education and technical assistance generally from the north to the south to really improve the understanding of the multidimensional benefits that these robust, healthy ecosystems are giving to communities and to align policies. But I also want to actually cast a light on some place where I think that businesses and local people's local government's capacity will need to be expanded, which is just behind the production system itself. Why are people burning forests to expand cropland? Is because there is an actual or a perceived access to fertile soil when you do that. I've had much experience with palm oil plantations in the tropics where after the first handful of years after the forest being burned, you have to increase the inputs of chemical fertilizers to keep up the production per hectare, implying more greenhouse gas emissions from nitrogen fertilizers and other chemicals and so forth. And I think that there's so much innovation happening around regenerative agricultural systems that are good for the climate, good for biodiversity, good for people, but there's not enough technical assistance, again, capacity building in that temporal unfurling of the sustainability of production systems to make it all work. So really a plea for integrated finance. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, and lots to reflect on as we wrap up the session. David,
just briefly perhaps reflect on this, on what Alan called this sort of encultured or inadvertent encultured protectionism that we see coming out of Brussels, that David Luke, sees DG Trade acting slightly different than perhaps Alan pointed it out. But I think what can't be denied is that there's a massively changing dynamic in Brussels in terms of lawmaking that affects supply chains and rules that affect trade, where we come from WTO law negotiations to FTA negotiations where DG Trade has been in charge. Now we're moving to autonomous measures where other agencies, these are run under different legal bases, not trade, legal bases that are environment, industry, and so on, where other DGs are in charge, like DG Grow or DG TaxSud and so on. And we see now battles between DG Trade and DG Grow or DG Trade and DG TaxSud and DG Environment, where DG Trade is in the inter-service consultation losing out more and more. Some of these battles DG Trade has won in the past, like for instance in the Net Zero Industrial Act, or in the CBAM regulation, where DG TaxSud first wanted to go ahead without a transition period, where DG Trade intervened and said we need that 3-year transition period in order to give countries the chance to implement. We have domestic content provisions in the Net Zero Industry Act, where DG Grow wanted to go ahead without with these WTO illegal domestic content provisions, and DG Trade pushed back. We have now the first instance with the recycled plastic packaging regulation, where DG Trade has completely lost out, fought a very difficult battle within the Commission against the French government. And for the first time, we have a new balance, and that is not only the structural protectionism that comes in through the French government and where the UK is dearly missed with the vis-a-vis the Germans or with the Germans that are used to create a more free trade orientation. So, by the way, to just exemplify the structural protectionism that is there, if you want to look at the French sentiment right now that is pushing for the mirror clauses in environmental regulations, you have the the European Parliament has voted with 80% in favor of the EU-Chile FTA, whereas the French members of the European Parliament have 80% voted against that agreement. So just to give a bit of an example of how things are changing in Brussels. I just wanted to mention that perhaps some of these regulations, once they're written into law, they can of course still be changed to some extent through implementing acts, where the implementing acts and the delegated acts still have to be adopted. At that stage, a lot can still be done. That is true for CBAM, and that is also true for the EU deforestation regulation. I have one question, if I may, that concerns. We've talked a lot about anecdotal evidence in terms of the supply chain effect of these regulations, and I think we're getting more and more comprehensive information about the anecdote, like what the picture may look like. Studies are being put out. I think the EU is terrible at PR in particular when it comes to compiling and advertising what it is doing to mitigate these effects. And when I'm just coming out of a dinner with Gerasimos Tomas, the head of DG Taxud, who is laying out a very, very comprehensive sort of image of a lot of anecdotal evidence, where in Mozambique for aluminium, etc., a lot is being done. The question is, we maybe not only need to sort of take a broader look at the effects on the supply chains, but also what is already being done and where the gaps are, and work on that basis.
Thanks very much indeed, David. So I'm pretty conscious of time. I do want to come back to the panel as well. So we have four interventions now. If we can go, if Nimrod is on the line, we'll go to Nimrod first, Salamat, Simon,
Yes.
and then Hans-Peter, and then we will come back to the panel. Okay. Our lead interventions, I should say. So Nimrod, we can hear you now.
Great. Thanks very much, Jody. And apologies, my connection dropped for some reason. I was trying to say that in the CBAMs, I think are quite a different mechanism to the various directives and regulations. The practical effect of the CBAM is very much of a tariff, which I think it's safe to say is targeted primarily at China as the largest steel producer in the world. And a country like Mozambique is really ending up being collateral damage within that broader geopolitical frame. The directives and regulations, the one question I had is, what lessons have we learned from the systems that were put in place to try and audit labor standards in the apparel sector? How effective were those? And drawing from those lessons, what is the degree of effectiveness that we think that these similar types of audits will have? I would anticipate that there's going to be a cascading set of legal obligations that are pushed lower and lower down the value chain, and that the major beneficiaries would be various consultants, and that this might end up being, in a sense, the worst of all worlds in a number of respects, except perhaps for being quite a good industrial policy for the consulting sector. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Nimrod. So over to you, Salamat, and then Simon.
Thanks, Jody. Very interesting discussion. I just wanted to add one point on the special and differential treatment for LDCs for the CBAM and other EUDR. I think the best example to implement this special and differential treatment comes from the EU itself, from this project which has been going on a long time on the GSP, GSP Plus, and duty-free quota scheme. So this GSP project, which has been very successful in most countries, have benefited from it. And it had 3 tiers of preferences: duty-free, quota-free for LDCs, then GSP for other developing countries, and GSP Plus for other developing countries. I think that structure could be very much replicated in EUDR as well as in the CBAM. And we see the success of this kind of arrangement in WTO's TFA also. The TFA provided more period for the LDCs, more reporting requirement, and I also supported them for the technical assistance. So most firms in the developing countries and country itself and the national government are willing to implement these laws, but they just look for the 2 things. First thing is the technical capacity and financial support to implement these regulations. And second thing, they want to know that it should create more business opportunities for them. Thank you. I stop here.
Thanks very much indeed, Sam. It's very, very helpful. And Simon.
Yeah, thanks. Great meeting. Really interesting, everybody. I've complained before about the term green squeeze, which kind of points us in the wrong direction when we're facing a climate emergency. But I want to make 3 other points which are related to the experience of fair trade. The first is in the fair trade system, producers who comply with the certification get a premium. And I wonder whether that shouldn't be discussed in this context, that producers are rewarded for all this work they have to do. Secondly, in the fair trade system, a big problem is that you pay the cost of certification as a producer, but then actually fair trade only takes a very small part of your output. And I think we're going to face this with all the initiatives you're talking about, because everybody's got different certification standards. And I wonder why there isn't any discussion of one common international standard. And there is an ISO certification 17065, which deals with standardization of standards. And I just think that would be a useful thing for you to have. And the third is that there was always a big debate in fair trade between the Fair Trade Foundation, which insisted that everything that can be fair trade should be fair trade in a product. And fair trade had a standard you either passed or failed. That was on the one hand. On the other hand, you had the Rainforest Alliance, who said, we're on a journey, here's a ladder, we'll take the first steps together and then we'll do the next steps. And we should think about this in a 10 or 15 year context. And that's another technology that could be applied to this whole debate. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Simon. Very, very helpful as well. Hans-Peter, final bit and we'll go back to yours again.
As I guess building on what Simon said, same direction. It's very hard to see from this discussion what it is that could actually be done about these problems, because the regulations themselves, it seems they go by their own rhythm, very hard to influence and change. Technical assistance typically been very unsuccessful. Aid to trade has not been very successful. So what is it that we're left with in a way? Should we be fatalistic about that, or go down the route of some of what Simon has been alluding to? Are there other approaches? Are there digital approaches? Are there ways of standardization? What would we put into the brief of the next commission? There are so many organizations currently thinking about what to put into their briefs, including ourselves. What is it that we would put in there to address these issues?
Thank you very much indeed, Hans-Peter. So a lot to think about. So I'm pleased that this meeting is recorded, and we will share the recording with you after this discussion and any related research outputs. And we'd encourage you to do the same. Please do share with us any related information. So yeah, I'm very much struck that, in order to turn these dynamics around, perhaps we need to be looking at other policy instruments. I've read recently about the example of Costa Rica in terms of reducing deforestation. It looked into services and the pharmaceutical industry. So, quite a different approach perhaps and we can learn some lessons there. I'd like to turn now to the lead interventions for any closing remarks and as we wrap up this session. So Alan, over to you if you have any final reflections. I think David Beer, you're still on the line. Just a couple of minutes just to wrap up would be super helpful. And then George and David, and then we'll close. Thank you.
I'm trying to think what I have, which is not a counsel of despair. Because yeah, I mean, like David, I keep hearing expressions like common but defense responsibility in one context, but never in any other context, right? In context of one particular climate change, but it's not the context you ever hear in the WTO. It's not a concept which is brought into anything else. And then all of these, it's not just the institutions themselves, but it appears to be the legal approaches and the philosophical approaches all appear to be sort of atomized. Nor, I'm not a lawyer, but nor can I necessarily see how the structures that are created can be used. I mean, I know sometimes systems can be created and actors can use them in ways that weren't necessarily intended. And this just came to mind because I saw a remarkable story that the this is not to do with development, but the Union of Auto Workers, UAW in the US, has just filed a case against Mercedes-Benz in Alabama to the German regulator on labour standards because they're essentially trying to. That was obviously not not that it was something that was particularly intended, but again, with these sorts of systems, it's not clear to me what if there's any kind of legal mechanism to which they're sort of repellable. So I would say, you know, if you're going to mitigate these, and if you're going to try and mitigate them at the policy level in the EU rather than on the ground, which is the first of those is something I know more about, you need allies. And those allies can be campaigners, and I agree entirely. I think that the NGO movement has shifted a lot. I remember the great sucking sound as everybody, NGOs stopped working on trade, more or less around 2008, and started working on climate. And I can exactly see why they would do that, but at the same time, that means that, you know, you have lots of people in NGOs who don't work on the development aspect. Maybe that's something that could be revived. And also, I wonder if the producers, the retailers, and so forth in the EU itself also might be recruited, because although they like very simplistic things like, you know, we do not sell palm oil because it's bad for the environment. If it is a question of saying it will hurt producers, then possibly they could be recruited as well. I'll give you an extraordinarily anecdotal piece on this, which is my home city of Chester designated itself, this is interesting, the first, not the first palm oil free, the first sustainable palm oil city in the world. Chester Zoo, which is a great zoo, please go to Chester Zoo, has an orangutan enclosure, taking the kids there. And what's remarkable is how nuanced all of the messaging is. I can show you if you like, which say palm oil is really essential. Palm oil is essential for people's livelihoods. Millions of people depend on palm oil. Palm oil is essential because if you shifted from palm oil to anything else, it would take up far too much land. Okay, now, you know, the extent to which that is a much more nuanced message and something I think you might have seen 5 or 10 or 15 years ago is quite impressive. I think there is something that you could build on there. It will take a long time to do it, but I think certain people do understand that there was more one aspect to a particular situation. There was a human aspect and the environmental aspect.
Very much. And David, if you're on the line, just 2 minutes, just to wrap up, David Beer.
Yeah, thanks. Very quickly, maybe I'll just cheat and summarise by popping together a couple of comments from other people. Totally agree. What we need is an active approach to countering impacts through development programming. That is not happening enough, and it's not happening in the right way. It is not, as some people said, about trying to drive production of certain products. That I think is frankly a bit intellectually arrogant and has not worked at all. I'm always astonished by the numbers thrown around on aid for trade and what people say they're giving. That is certainly not aid for trade facilitation. I think it's a little bit mischaracterized. What we need is intelligent trade facilitation. As people have said, advocacy to influence regulations, standardization of standards, implementation of our WTO regulations, core trade facilitation. We do that, we're going to start mitigating some of the necessary damage that is put in place by some of these climate-related trade restrictions. If we don't do that, we're not going anywhere. Thanks.
Very much, David. George.
Thank you. Just to add a couple of thoughts to Dirk's questions and what David and Alan have said, I think very much agree on where the European Union institutions are at the moment. Very siloed. DigiTrade isn't playing the role that perhaps it could. I think in terms of how you get this message across, unfortunately, you know, the development aspect is not going to cut through. In a world of strategic autonomy, I think the way through is European competitiveness, that until the downstream producers are really being impacted and having to withdraw from the market, that's the only point that you're really going to get the effectiveness in terms of the arguments. In terms of how do you move forward in improving some of these, absolutely implementation is a crucial part of that. The fact that for many of these regulations, we still don't have good guidance translations into the languages that they need to be translated into. And that is the first step to engaging with those suppliers. So we're not even at the starting blocks yet with some of it. The final point on CBAM and LDCs, just my current thinking and from our experience, CBAM right now doesn't matter to LDCs because the only one impacted is Mozambique, and then it's one country, one company, effectively. If you see an expansion in the coverage of CBAM, that's when you have to worry, but we're a couple of years away from that, so preparation should be done, including for the UK CBAM. Right now, I think in terms of LDCs, it's deforestation that is much more impacted and impactful. So
yeah, thanks very much, George. And David, over to you, and then we'll pass back to our Excellency as well for the short close.
You know, I think African countries face a very difficult period of in dealing with this climate situation, and indeed, I'd like to see as much emphasis on the common as well as on the differentiated responsibility. You know, I think much of what we've talked about also comes down to cost and how you manage those costs. And I think it's very clear that we're not finding a way on climate finance, like Hans-Peter was the question, what are we left with? I think we're left with going back to looking at how we can price carbon and how we can do this in a way that generates the kind of financing that can help to meet these costs that African countries face. Very clear that for those that have carbon assets, that's a very promising route, but we all know the problems with dealing with that voluntary carbon markets and so on. You know, so really, I think we need to look back again at the how we price carbon and the resources that we can get from that, and do that in a differentiated way. My last point is taking the employment's point on the nuances, DigiTrade and the rest of the other areas of the EU Commission. And DigiTrade, of course, as he points out, losing some of the battles and so on, as we see this very focus that different parts of the Commission have on this different parts of the agenda. So I'll leave it at that. Last point really is this very difficult trade-off that all countries face, them to do with extreme poverty, but also respond to the climate emergency.
Thank you very much, David. So just to close the session, we'll pass over to the Ambassador directly for final reflections. You've heard a lot, a rich and engaging discussion. I'd like to thank everyone for joining this conversation. But over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you so much. It is an interesting platform. Thank you again, ODI, for bringing this important discussion today. We are engaging the EU on this, and we'll continue engaging the EU. But one point that was raised here in the discussion, I felt it's important, the issue of international standards as opposed to unilateral measures would be the right direction as we share a common world that is facing climate change. So thank you again, and I look forward to the outcome of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency. So great. So we'll keep everyone in the loop as we move forward, share the recording. But thank you very much indeed for your time and preparation. It's really very much appreciated. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you.